Thank you so much for coming to a talk on developmental trauma and how we can heal developmental trauma. Okay, all right. Carrie, can you put up the volume just a little? Okay. And again, I'll wait till everybody's seated. Okay, how's the sound now? Can you hear in the back? Yeah, okay. All right, so welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to a talk on developmental trauma and healing developmental trauma. As we know, there's very many terrible events that can happen in the world today for children that can elicit trauma. We know trauma lives in the body. It's not in the traumatic events that are out there. We know there's all kinds of terrible abuse that can happen to a child. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse. We know there's losses that can happen, accidents, falls, surgeries. But that's not exactly what I'm going to be focusing on today with this talk on developmental trauma. I'm going to be talking about the trauma that emerges within our body from what doesn't happen or what we don't receive. From this point of view, I think trauma is a silent epidemic that has been causing and still causes infinite amounts of pain and suffering and really limits our lives in ways that we may not recognize because we feel it might be normal. We may have been living with these particular ways of being our whole life. So when we are children, beginning in utero, with infants, babies, children, we all have essential needs. And if those essential needs do not get met, then the infant, the child's organism, their body senses some kind of threat to different degrees depending upon the developmental age of the child. So that threat, if it's not attended to, begins to cultivate a sense of what we call trauma within the body. What are the essential needs? Right? We need to be held. We need to be nourished. We need to be nurtured. We really need to be seen and heard. We need to be acknowledged. We need to be attuned to. And we need to be mirrored. And any lack of that over a long period of time, or when those needs aren't being met on a consistent basis, the infant, the child can begin to feel some form of threat. And when we feel threat, we begin to close down and contract a little bit. And when we contract, we have to find these adaptations or strategies or ways of being in the world to negotiate that contraction or that sense of threat within us. Before I get too much into that, I'm going to tell you a story of a lady who came to see me. She's a medical doctor. She's actually the head of a well-known hospital, so she's a very smart lady. And the first thing she said to me when she came into my office, she came to see me because I work with trauma, was, I actually don't have any trauma. She said, I had a really nice upbringing and, I have a very successful life and I had no traumas in adulthood. But I'm suffering with these symptoms that I often hear you talk about. She heard some of my talks of depression and anxiety, and I'm beginning to not be able to sleep through the night, and I can't trace why this is happening to me, and I'm really choosing not to go on any kind of medication. I want to find a way through this. And this lady had done a lot of self-growth work, a lot of self-development work, but nothing had really got to the crux of the anguish that she was really beginning to suffer with. So that's how she began our journey together, and she ended it with, oh my gosh, Julie, you have to tell people about the trauma that emerges from what doesn't happen to you. Because she said, I had no idea, and I've been in the medical field and dealing with people with all kinds of trauma my whole life. So she comes into my office, and I have two big chairs and a couch. And one of the first things she said to me is, can I sit on the couch next to you? And I said, yeah, of course. She said, I really want to feel safe with you, and I really want to feel connected. So right there in her languaging, she was already telling me what she might need from our time together. And then she said, I have to tell you, ever since I've called you to make an appointment, and especially this morning, I've had this terrible pain on the occiput, so the back of the skull where it meets the top of the neck, a tremendous amount of pain and tightness. So she's sitting next to me on the couch, and I said, well, is it okay if I put my hand there? And she said, yeah, I'd really love you just to feel it. So I put my hand on the back of her neck and the lower portion of her skull, and I'm connecting with her, right? I'm sitting with her in a sense of presence, right? Seeing her, making contact with her. And all of a sudden, from the depth what felt like her core came this howling cry, this like howl, so painful, right? And it just shuddered through her. Her face went bright red and she looked like a tiny baby screaming. Now, there's one thing I have to say before I go on with the story. If you are working with trauma or you work with people with trauma, it is really important to not regress into a childhood state, right? Or childhood consciousness. All that's going to do is allow you to relive the trauma that you may have had back then. Afterwards, after a big cathartic experience of crying and who knows what, you might actually feel good because the body in a state of threat is going to release endogenous opioids that are your body's natural painkillers, which are going to allow you to feel good for a little while. It's actually part of a shutdown state, which is part of a preparatory death state, just in case death ensues, to allow us to have a less painful death. So if you just regress into childhood states, you're just pretty much reliving the trauma and not healing anything. So as this lady, this big cry comes up, and it seemed like this was a very, very early state, consciousness of a very young state she was experiencing. My job is to make sure her adult consciousness, right, her sense of self was very present with us in the room at the same time. So I made sure it was. I talked to her. I said, I need you to stay with me. I need you to be right here with me. And she said, yeah. And she said, oh my God. She said, there's so much terror in my body right now. There's so much terror. And this has been with me my whole life, she said, and I didn't know. Right? And as we sat with that terror, we didn't dive into it. She didn't have to disappear into the terror. She just had to, with her awareness that she was able to cultivate in this sense of presence and connection with another person, something that she didn't have when the original trauma was happening, right? She was able to negotiate that terror that was living inside of her system. So we negotiated this terror, touching into it, coming out. I could feel her physiology changing and shifting a little bit as she met it and was present with it. By the way, she came for a 2-hour session because she said she didn't have a whole lot of time to come every week. And this is a pretty condensed session, right? So we negotiated this would be okay to talk about in one of my talks. Okay? So the next thing that came up after this terror was her saying, wow, I'm really feeling like I'm touching into my body for the first time. She said, I don't think I've ever really been connected to my body, and I do yoga, and I go running, and I do Pilates, but I've never felt my body in the way that I'm feeling it right now. So we sat with that for a little bit, and we worked with that. And then up came this huge wave of anger that very quickly turned into rage. And the same thing, if she'd just gone into this big, cathartic, rageful experience without any presence or capacity to observe it or witness it, it would have just re-traumatized her. Rage is a really terrifying experience to feel unless you've developed the container. Your body is a container or a vessel to really be able to feel that emotion. And once you develop your body as a container to feel emotion, then rage, as it transmutes in the body in this alchemical process, is one of the most powerful emotions that we can feel for our own self-empowerment and awakening and opening up, if you will. But however, this lady really hadn't been in her body most of her life, and up comes this rage. So the same thing, I still have a connection with her. I still have my hand on her, and I'm feeling into her physiology. And I'm looking at her, and I'm looking at all of her nervous system signs on her face to make sure she's still here, she's present, she's connected with me, she's able to tell me exactly what's happening in her system as she touches into this rage. Now, sometimes rage does need to be expressed. Again, when we're present to it, when we can be aware of it, not in a big cathartic explosion, it really doesn't help, or it really doesn't transmute that rageful energy back into your life force, which is really what we want to have happen, right? Energy is emotion, emotion is energy. Rage is when it gets distorted. If it's been hanging around too long, it's really not useful, and it tends to turn back against us into something like self-loathing, self-criticism, self-judgment. And many of us don't realize that that emotion or those ways of being that we may have had all of our life are actually coming from anger that's turned against ourselves, because we have never really been able to meet it or to process it. So here she is, she meets these huge states of rage. And again, we negotiate it together. He just touches into it. She feels it. Huge waves of heat are coming out of this energy that she doesn't need, leaves, and the rage itself begins to shift. And this takes a little while and a little interaction. And then after that is done for that moment, of course, we revisited it another time. She collapsed back on the couch in a sense of exhaustion, right? Like absolute exhaustion. And she went, oh my God, I've been exhausted my whole life. And I didn't even realize, right? She'd been keeping herself disconnected from her body. She'd been keeping herself disconnected from her emotions. Her emotions are her energy, her life force, right? And she needs to use her life force to keep those emotions at bay, right? So she's completely limiting her life and who she is and her expression in the world, right? So let me speak a little bit about early trauma, beginning in childhood. Let's look at infancy at first, because there's still this cultural misperception that says that leaving a baby alone to cry itself to sleep is appropriate caregiving. When in fact, if a baby is left to cry to sleep, maybe once, maybe a number of times, research shows that their brain has been flooded with neurotoxic stress hormones, right? That is going to damage the baby's well-being over time. Other research says that once the baby reaches a certain level of stress, this hyperarousal in the nervous system, right, of distress and then more distress and then anger and rage, it's so unbearable for that little organism, the child is going to shut down and dissociate. And of course, the systems in our body that are going to prevent death from ensuing, but they're disconnected from the body and they're disconnected from the emotion. And that could remain that way for the rest of their life or until they find some kind of resolution. So a distress call in an infant or a child is to alert distress in a caregiver. So the caregiver will come search out the child, and then the caregiver calms the child. So in the first year of an infant's life or a baby's life, they don't have their nervous system developed enough to be able to self-soothe. So a baby needs a nervous system of a calm, caring, loving, nurturing other to allow their nervous system to soothe, self-soothe, and to also for the development of the nervous system so they can do that throughout their lives. And this is what we also call being able to build resilience, right? If you're not connected to your body and you're not connected to emotion, right, you're going to have very little resilience. So what do? We avoid really touching into the body and we'll avoid really feeling emotion, right? Which is really not a very authentic way of being, because we are emotional beings and our emotions are part of our birthright, they're part of our life force, they're part of the makeup of who we are. Other things, I don't have time to go through all of the developmental stages in childhood and what might happen, but another one that I find really common with people that I work with and my colleagues and people who I talk to is when our need doesn't get met, of somebody attuning to us. When we have a need and we want to express it, and that is either ignored or disavowed or, not heard. And so we exile from our own needs. We foreclose them or shut them down, right? And so it's far too painful to have a need in childhood that doesn't get met, that to continue to long for that need to get met. It's far too painful. So we close down our needs and then maybe we begin to attend to the needs of others. And we grow up doing this with this underlying resentment because we tend to be doing things for everybody else, but nobody's doing anything for us. But the universe will always provide somebody who will enable our patterns just like we enable them, for us to somehow feel safe or to give us the opportunity to begin to resolve what might have happened to us early on in life that we are still playing out in adulthood. So I'm going to show you a series of images from a lady that I worked with for a couple of years. And when I asked her if I could show these paintings, she said, oh, yes, please, show them. Because when somebody witnesses my pain, it really helps. And I think that's a really important part of healing trauma, is to be witnessed in our pain by another so we don't feel so alone. Because at the root of all trauma is a sense of disconnection, right? It's disconnection from ourself, from our core, our authentic way of being, disconnection from our body, disconnection from those around us, disconnection from nature, possibly in the cosmos. So healing from trauma is about reconnection. So there's something really beautiful about being witnessed. I also think it's a metaphor for ultimately the witness and what's being witnessed as being the same, where real liberation can heal from our suffering. So as we're developing that capacity to witness and ultimately become the witness and what is being displayed, it's really lovely to be able to have somebody witness our pain, right? While we're cultivating the capacity to witness our own and staying present while we're resolving it. So this is a first painting. And by the way, they're not in any kind of linear process when I show them, because healing trauma tends not to be linear. We come up and down in these different phases as we touch into different experiences that we might have had at different times of our childhood. But you can see here, this one is really depicting this fragmentation. Things are just too much. In this image here, we'll see again at the end of the slides, this is really this capacity to play is dissolving, right? To the loss of the capacity to play when we feel some kind of threat or our needs don't get met in childhood. Also, when we're unable to really access anger, I'm going to say this, it's important, we really lose our capacity to play. When a child gets angry, right, and they get told off for being angry or ignored for being angry, or people, put them away in another room because they're being angry. What that anger is a call for connection, right? An evolutionary call for connection. Like, come to me, I need you, I have a need, I'm in distress, right? And yet nobody comes, or if nobody comes, that distress goes higher and higher, and now we have rage. And then that has to get dissociated off, like I said. So here's another picture that shows what's happened. She's having some kind of experience where nobody is coming to her. And this is how it feels, is this deep contraction in the body. Again, we see some fragmentation and dissociation happening as she just curls in and contracts. And even though she's going to stand up and move on in her life, this is what's still happening inside. This is what was still happening inside when she's in her 40s. And she had no idea, by the way. She went on, and she's both an academic and also went into spiritual communities to a very high degree. And neither one of those was able to access this trauma, right? So there was this beautiful avoidance of her body because it was far too painful, first into her intellect and then into the spiritual realms, where nobody really looked to see what was at the crux of the anguish of all of the symptoms that were beginning to come up, until she eventually found that she couldn't function so much in the world. This is anger that she first touched into. And I think it's just a beautiful expression of the wildness and how terrifying that could be. And obviously in her expression of it, the rage at the Creator, what she called God, in those moments. And it was so terrifying to touch into this, but when she did, it began to transform a little bit. But this is what she felt like she'd been avoiding her whole life, because as a child, how do you touch that? How do you hold that unless you have some other person with you who's loving and kind and calm and nurturing and lets you know you're safe and you're okay? All of these things that a child needs. So this got, dissociated, disconnected from. This is just a little bit of a close-up. Look at that jaw, those teeth. It's terrifying, right? But this eventually got transmuted, right, in this beautiful alchemical process in her body, with connection with another, with being witnessed, touching into it, feeling this kind of energy moving through her without having to attack anybody else, without having to attack herself, but actually just be present with it. This transmuted into a power, internal power, that allowed her to move forward in her life and begin to heal with confidence and a sense of uprightness. It was really, really powerful. It's not always that easy to touch into that rage, because often when there's a splitting or a disconnection from our core self, or maybe our core self splits off, there's another splitting happen, and what comes up is something that we call like a defense system, and this is her depiction of the defense that is not going to let anybody near that early wounding, and is not going to let anybody get her to come into a body. And of course, in healing trauma, we're not about getting anybody into the body. We're about seeing what's in the way of somebody wanting to come back and connect to the body. And for her, of course, it was terror and it was rage. So we had to work with this beautiful figure here that was really, really frightening for her. And ultimately, this became a good dragon, and that good dragon became more of her power and her force to be able to face more things in life that she'd been really, really afraid of. This is an image that comes up with so many people that I work with when they're healing trauma. This panther, an image of a panther, and sometimes it can feel really daunting and quite frightening. But if you look up symbolism, right, from the psyche, the panther usually represents some kind of courage and strength and valor. Sometimes it has this sort of Dionysian energy that has to do with Kundalini, but it's a really strong force, a part of our life force, that when we can harness this, you can really make incredible changes with how you feel about yourself and the world. So this is the beginning of a transformation of another level of anger for her. Because there was still a lot of self-criticism, still a lot of self-loathing, still a lot of self-judgment. And a lot of you might experience those types of feelings or inner workings of your mind and not realize that's anger going in towards you. So just be aware of that the next time you hear yourself self-judging or self-criticizing or self-hating in some way. There's probably some unresolved anger there that is just working against you, rather than being able to harness it and utilize it to work for you. So she began to connect with that energy in her body and allow it move through her a little bit more as we began to touch into what was missing for her. Again, we're talking about trauma that emerges from what was missing. Right? For her, it was being seen, it was being heard. There really wasn't a caring, loving other available to her, even though her mother was always around. Her mother also, actually not just this lady, but the doctor that I was first talking about, her mother was always around, but her nervous system was not calm enough for her to be able to sit in presence with her child to allow her child to feel safe. So her mother always seemed absent. But she remembered sometimes that her mother did connect, and she would see this beautiful light of love shining through her eyes, right, just once in a while. And she said, I remember remembering that. But it was so frightening because it would go away so quick that I shut down my heart to it. And that's a lot of people's work, is to begin to open the heart up again to love. Because if we're not met by another with kind, loving eyes, something we really need as a child, then we don't recognize that within ourselves. Right? So we come into this world, we really want to have a mother or a mother functioning figure, whoever that might be, to look into our eyes and see us as love, so that love can resonate in us and we know that's who we are. And with that, then we can navigate life with whatever happens. But so often we close our hearts down from that because it's so painful for the experience of it coming and going, or from it never being there at all, or for us not to be able to see it or feel it. Every parent loves their child, but not everybody is able to express that because of their own trauma or circumstances that might be happening around them. So this is a place where we were really looking at existence. And again, not to talk about her story, but many people's story, we touch into a place of terror. And often what's connected to that terror, if I touch into my body or I touch my emotions or I, go near these difficult feelings that are beginning to come up, I'm going to be annihilated, right? And annihilation isn't death. Annihilation is a sense of existing in non-existence. So to me, that's much more terrifying. There you are in nothing with no one. And as a child, right, of course you're going to disconnect from that experience. How can you hold that? But so many children experience that when they don't have the love, the nurturance, the holding, the attunement, the mirroring, right, the nourishment that they need to feel safe in their body. Right? And safety doesn't come from the absence of threat, right? Safety comes from all of those wonderful needs that a child has that caregivers, right, need to be able to give. So this is negotiating that sense of annihilation. And again, if that comes up, we don't want to jump into that space. We want to touch it with awareness and to feel how that feels in the body, right? So the body awareness is always important. Having a sense of being able to observe or witness is always important. So we're always cultivating that, working with trauma, right? So we have a bigger container of body, we have a larger container of mind, we have a greater capacity to observe, so we can feel all of these energies, our life force, as they begin to move back through us, bring us more alive, create more vitality and aliveness in us. Where you can see here the broken heart. This is where there's a sense of disconnecting or leaving her body. And then this is part of the integration process of, as well, healing trauma is all about reconnecting. It's all about assimilating, gathering all of these parts, pieces of us that might have split off or been disconnected. And so assimilation and integration is a really important part of healing trauma. And this is two young parts that she found that were beginning to make friends, if you will, right? So there's an adult self online, but she's also aware of these two young parts. One is like an infant, and another looks about 3 years old. And the 3-year-old is saying, I'm sorry no one was there for you. And I'm sorry I couldn't help you. Please forgive me. So whenever trauma happens in childhood, right, whenever we become traumatized, which is really something that feels too much for us to be able to bear in the moment, right? That part of our consciousness splits off and is encapsulated in time, right? So it's not like we have a lot of inner children running around anywhere. We don't want to reify inner children, but we do want to recognize that our consciousness is split off, encapsulated in time. And so often through our life, right, when we come into a difficult situation or something that has any kind of resonance to our past, we begin to look through the lens of the consciousness of the child consciousness or early consciousness that got split off, right? And that's where we begin to replay or relive the dramas of our childhood in our adult relationships, not really understanding what's happening or not really being aware that maybe this is, me being triggered and this is something inside of me that's unresolved. So this is part of that beautiful integration process of the recognition of the pain that she endured, of that consciousness that was still alive, if you will, even if frozen in time, that began to come back in her body. And as she felt it, that's when this beautiful integration process begins to happen. This is about exhaustion. So this is, again, a point where we realize just how exhausting it is to live with trauma, even when we don't know we have trauma. There's a lot of people don't. Like I said, it's like a silent epidemic. We don't remember that we don't get our needs met because that's all we know in childhood. We don't realize things are missing, but we do adapt to what's missing with ways of being that are really not our most authentic and true self, right? We learn to put other people's feelings and ideas before us. We feel, well, I better not speak up because if I speak up, people aren't going to like me because maybe that was a belief you had in childhood. And if people don't like me, I'm going to be alone. And if I'm alone, I'm going to be abandoned. And underneath that abandonment is usually some form of or annihilation. But we tend to not go all the way down and follow that trail down into our body, into our psyche to see what's under these assumptions that we have in adulthood about, not wanting to speak up or not to express our emotions or to not feel our emotions. And so we pretty much exhaust ourselves because we're keeping all of that energy at bay, right? We're not living with our full flow of life force and vitality and aliveness that's available to us when we go through the integration process. And this is part of the healing process where she felt she could exhale and the breath could begin to move within her again. Right? Because so often the breath is being held in or the breath is being held out and we're really not having that wonderful prana life force energy from outside mixed with our inside vitality and prana to give us a greater access to vitality and joy. And he would come back towards the end of the healing process. Play comes back, right? She's dealt with her anger, she's dealt with emotions, right? We've renegotiated this relationship with her body with her mind, with all emotions, with feeling, with being able to express with safety, and play comes back, right? And it's such a beautiful place to be able to be in the world in a playful way. So I want to speak about one of the difficulties that I find that is again, really, really common in the field that I'm working in and with people that I talk to. And it's this capacity to really fully love. Right? And I spoke a little bit about it, but I want to reiterate it a little bit. When we don't feel loved when we're an infant or a child, we close ourselves off from that because it is so painful, it is so unbearable. And so we go through life not feeling love, not as fully as we could, or not as fully as we're capable of. So beginning, you're part of the healing process, however you can begin to do this. One is to begin to look within and feel, what are my needs? Not I need to do this and I need to do that. That's usually, when I ask people a question, there's a whole to-do list. No, not what you need to do, but like, what do you need? And the most common response I get from people, I don't know what I need. They've shut down really what they need and are unable to ask for it. So a beginning part is to be able to know what we need. We may not be able to give ourselves what we need, but we're adults now. As children, that was terrifying and felt almost life-threatening. But as an adult, if I don't get my needs met, it might not feel good. It might even be a little scary sometimes, or sometimes lonely. But I'm good with that, right? I'm not going to be annihilated. Right? But as a child, no, that's terrifying. And so you shut down from that. So as adults, if we feel we have trauma, let's hold on, or feel like we don't, let's really find out, what is it I need, right? Do I just need to be held? Do I need love? Do I need to be seen? Do I need to be heard? And we begin, first of all, just to acknowledge that and how that feels in your body when you acknowledge your needs. You'll notice some kind of physiological shift. Because remember, when those needs are not being met as an infant or a child, this is when your physiology is developing. And your sense of self, which is really important before you ever begin to think about not having a sense of self in spirituality. You need to have a very strong sense of self, right? But your sense of self is being built upon a disrupted physiology, right? And so you have this disrupted physiology that's trying to help develop a sense of self with fear and anger and all kinds of unprocessed emotions in there. So as we begin to know what we need and acknowledge that within us, how it feels, right? A shift begins in the physiology that begins to move us back towards a much more organized state. All of this trauma, right, creates a disorganized system, if you will. And as we begin to come back to ourselves, maybe we'll feel a little bit more chaos at first, but it's a kind of chaos that if we stay present with it, is going to reorganize at a higher level or a more coherent level of order in our physiology. Okay? So the first thing is to know what you need, right? And then maybe you can actually go ask somebody or give it to yourself, right? And really acknowledge and feel that. And if you can't, to know what it's like to have a need and to not have it met. Right? And really face that. It might be a little fearful. You might be some anger. But if you're also cultivating this relationship with your body, either by yourself in your own practices, with a therapist, with a group of friends, in whatever way you're doing that, it's really, really, really powerful means to begin a healing journey. So I just have a couple of minutes left. I'm going to end what I was talking about on love first. So we close our heart down from love. So one of the gestures of a gesture of love is to actually come back to ourselves, to meet our own needs, right? It's actually a beautiful spiritual gesture that is saying, I'm willing to risk again the loss of love, which is probably the most painful experience in childhood, because that's going to be happening in most traumas. So I'm willing to risk loving because I'm going to be risking being denied love, right? And when we can do that, we open ourselves back up to love, our own love and the love of others. And maybe the love of another won't come and they actually do deny our love. And that's going to hurt, but it's okay, because as long as we can feel that hurt and don't shut ourselves off and deny it, at some point it'll pass, but our love is still there and our heart is still open and we're still connected to our being and our authentic expression. Okay, so I will take some questions if anybody has any. I'm going to take the hand over there first. Hi.
A quick question, then a more elaborate question. So is there a good resource So quick question, then an elaborate question. So is there a good resource online to look at what are the basic developmental needs being seen, being heard, being touched that you can point to, or maybe one of your books that I can go and I can, because I appreciate your talk, but I didn't write them all down. So that's the first question. The second is going to this core need. Okay, let's say you have a mother who has maybe a postpartum depression or something difficult, maybe either in utero or 0 to 3 type of effect upon the child. What's your sense of the need of the infant for a body energy field? Okay, so let's say the mother is traumatized and she has an HPA accident or a kidney, and her spine is twisted, her cheese pulled in, maybe she has an inflammatory response in her belly, something like that disrupts the core navel energy flow. Because when you're in utero, you have an umbilical cord, but then you're outside of the world. And the sense from kind of almost an esoteric sense that we as infants and as people need a belly-to-belly, navel-to-navel chi, okay, that contributes to our sense of safety and coherence. Any sense about that idea?
Yeah, I think energy fields are co-mingling, right? The mother or the mother functioning figure and the infant. Of course, there's a great importance of that field. I'm not going to speak too much directly to that about the core of the belly, because that's not my field of expertise. But if a mother's, like you're saying, traumatized and has all kinds of things going on, I'm sure her energetic field, right, which is love and compassion, when you're with a baby, the compassion, when we're holding a child, we're usually feeling some form of love and compassion if we're available, right? And that's lighting up the sense of, I'm going in a different direction with that. It's going to be too elaborate.
That may be pointing to that?
Let me think about it and I'll give it to you afterwards if you like some books and some online resources. Okay, another question. Yes. Oh, okay. So we thought the person after me was cancelled, so I was going to do more questions, but no, somebody's coming in.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Can you speak a little bit about identifying with trauma? So, like developing a victim's persona with trauma, and how to navigate with the trauma without, further damaging your psyche. Did that make sense?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking, but one thing I could say from what I do think I'm hearing is to be working with another who can really hold that space. I don't know if you're talking about yourself or another, but I think it's really important to be, when trauma is relational, and especially early trauma. So it's really important, I think, to be working with another person while you're working with your trauma or working through it, so they can be what wasn't given to you. Like this doctor, this lady that I was working with, right? She never had that sense of connection, holding, or somebody really being present with her that wasn't afraid of emotion. So I was that for her, what she didn't get. And that kept her safe. So we really want to, I think initially when we're working with trauma, to make sure we're in an environment with a person, another who feels safe, who can elicit a sense of safety within us. Because I think having safety is probably the initial step to healing trauma. Somehow beginning to feel safe in our body or safe with another if that's possible. Okay, all right. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming.